the work that I've been doing in the past couple years is I've been working on a people's history project of around environmental justice on the U.S.-Mexico border, specifically around maquiladoras, which are foreign-owned manufacturing plants that import resources into Mexico and export like finished products back out. And the maquiladoras use mostly female labor and have like very little labor rights. Like there aren't really any unions in the maquiladoras, and most of the time people are working with like dangerous chemicals without really any protective gear on. And I'm specifically working on a case that was a battery recycling plant that basically imported car batteries into Tijuana and then exported copper, I believe it was, back into the U.S. The border industrialization program, which started in the 1980s, and was basically a program to get the border region specifically industrialized. And then the way that NAFTA exacerbated that by making it possible for more maquiladoras to spring up specifically around the border region, because it's cheaper for factories to move products across the border if they're closer to the border. The North American Free Trade Agreement made it possible for U.S., specifically U.S. and Canadian companies to be able to come in to Mexico to like manufacture, like I was saying, like import raw materials and export like finished products without paying tariffs. So like without having to pay like taxes to come and do manufacturing into Mexico. And so what it promoted was a lack of enforcement of specific laws that weren't enforced so much in Mexico as they were in the U.S. and Canada. Like, for example, environmental laws. And when NAFTA passed, there was so much like discontent about the fact that it would cause a lot of like companies to move south and therefore like destabilize wages in the U.S. and in Canada. So when NAFTA passed, it came with two-side agreements, one that was a labor agreement and one that was an environmental agreement. And I don't know much about the labor agreement, but I know that it hasn't been effective. And I do know more about the environmental side agreement, which really all it did was create an agency called the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. That's a trilateral organization in which like communities can petition this organization to investigate specific sites. So like the community that was involved with the Metales Derivados remediation did that. They like petitioned the CEC to do an investigation, but really all that agency is able to do is investigate and say like, yeah, there's a problem here, but they don't really have any enforcement capabilities. They're just there to say you should clean this up or you should do something about that to the governments, to the three governments. So NAFTA really was like a way for corporations to come into Mexico without having to meet like the same labor and environmental standards of the U.S. and Canada. It has done what people feared it would do, like destabilize wages in the U.S. and also like make Mexico and Latin America, like through the other free trade agreements that have come after that, seem like they are like a source of cheap labor and that's really what they're there for. So like ultimately the labor of like Latin Americans becomes less valuable than the labor of people in the U.S. and in Canada because the free trade agreements facilitate that. When I was a student at San Diego State, I went on a border tour with one of the Chicano organizations I was involved with, and Magdalena Cerda, who's an organizer for the Environmental Health Coalition and the Colectivo. She facilitated the tour, and we went to what used to be the Metales Derivados site, and she talked about like the struggle of getting it remediated, and basically talked a lot about the issues of the maquiladora industry. And it got me really interested, so when I had the opportunity to do a research project, I went and talked with Magdalena and asked her if there was any project that would be helpful for them for me to do. And she told me that they had been working on something like a people's history of Metales y Derivados, because the Mexican government was planning on writing one, but like in blanco, which means like an objective book, which to them read as like a book that would paint the Mexican government as like who made the remediation possible, basically. I think the idea that like specifically the Colectivo had was that if a history is written about like specifically the case of Metales y Derivados, that is a top-down history, that it reinforces the idea that communities can act on their own to protect like their health, their resources, like their communities basically. And so I think that the idea of writing a people's history is more about a story that's more accurate, like having like both sides of the story, with the idea that a people's history would include like a bigger like structural story of like how things have gotten to be where they are now, and what the context is in which people have to struggle to, like, for example, get this toxic waste site remediated. So I think that in having a people's history, there's like more of a story about how things change than like how current structures facilitate. Like I feel like what I'm trying to say is that what I feel that like the book that is being written by the Mexican government can be, I see that it would be more about how like certain policy or like how certain laws facilitated the remediation of Metales, because they were there, like there was legal groundings on it getting remediated. But if you really look at the way that events played out, and if you have the insights of like the communities that struggled against or towards getting the site remediated, then you could see that a lot of the things wouldn't have moved forward if there wasn't like this constant push from people to make change, and that it's not about like whether there's laws written or policy that enables like government officials or agencies to like make things happen, but it really is about like a push from like who the people are that they're supposed to serve. So I think that like when you write a people's history, it makes it more clear that it isn't like as one-sided as it's supposed to seem. There's a hope that if this history is written from the perspective of the activists, that it could also work to inspire or influence other people who like they know there's other communities along the border who are also like facing similar toxic waste sites or like other environmental problems because of the maquiladora industry. And there's an idea that if something is written in the perspective of like an activist agenda, then that other people will see that and be influenced or inspired to know that like people can make their change by like not only through top-down strategies, you know. So my project specifically is looking at, like I said, the processes that were in place that made the maquiladora industry what it is today, and also the social movement strategies that it took to get the site remediated, because this plant was closed down in 1999, and it took about 10 years to get the site completely remediated. In 2007 is when the remediation plan was signed, that the Mexican and the U.S. governments said that they would work on cleaning the site collaboratively, and it was the first time that the U.S. EPA has collaborated on a project outside of the U.S. I think that this specific kind of work is at the intersection of a lot of things that I'm really committed to, like the ending of free trade agreements, which I hope will be a goal of my life, and issues of environmental contamination, popular education, also like participatory decision making. Like the environmental justice work specifically in Tijuana and San Diego is I think at the intersection of a lot of things that I had been interested in, that I hadn't been able really to find like a middle point for, and this specific project to me was that middle point.